Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Dr. Maria Kiladi, and I am the research fellow on the Legacies of Eugenics project that has been set up with the leadership of Professor Joe Kane at UCL on the Department of Science and Technology Studies. And what we thought we will do for this month's blog, we thought it would be a good idea to have a video with a real specialist here on anything that has to do with eugenics, archives, and books at UCL. And so we have with us today Ms. Erika Delbecq, who is the Rare Books librarian. Am I correct?
The head of Rare Books, actually.
The head of Rare Books, yes.
Exactly.
We have Ms. Katie Mackin. She is the archivist at UCL. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And of course, Mr. Colin Penman, head of the Records Office. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, well, four of us, we have a chat about the sources, the archives and books and the material we have at UCL, and hopefully we kind of clarify a few things about the collections and how it works, where you can find it, and whether you can actually, they are accessible to the public. So, so let's start with you, Erika. Would you like to tell us what is basically the Rare Books? What is Rare Books and where it belongs, and can we request them? How does this work with Rare Books?
Oh, so the Rare Books collection is one of the collections that is looked after by the UCL Special Collections team, which is part of library services. Now, the Rare Books collection consists of about 150,000 rare books, journals, and pamphlets. The earliest item that we have is from 1467, and the latest items we have are from the 21st century. So it covers an enormous range of time. It contains what you would expect from a rare book collection, your rare first editions, annotated books by important authors and historical figures, but it also contains things like underground printing from the 20th century. So it's a very broad and varied and interesting collection.
Mm-hmm. And it's like you said, I mean, it's very interesting how you also kind of differentiate it from books and pamphlets. Can you tell us a little bit about the Galton Laboratory books, what they are and how do they fit in, the Rare Books collection?
Yes, so within our Rare Books collection, we have about 50 discrete collections, one of which is the Galton Laboratory Books collection. It's a collection of about 5,000 items. That we look after. It consists of mostly books, but also journals and pamphlets, all to do with eugenics, statistics, and genetics mostly. And there's also related sciences, or in the case of eugenics, pseudosciences such as anatomy, mathematics, and anthropology. The material ranges from the early 18th century till the mid 20th century, and it's the largest collection related to eugenics in the United Kingdom.
Impressive. And as far as I know, they are also catalogued, so it's something that people can find on Explore, isn't it? And
exactly. The collection is fully catalogued, so it can all be found on Explore and requested from there.
Yeah. And so, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Andrea Watson from the retrospective cataloging team who actually introduced this string. And I think if you put on Explore Galton Laboratory as one word, essentially you tell Explore to just grab all these items, which is really impressive. I mean, the first time I did it, it's the number of books and records that appeared just, blew my mind. So yeah, really wonderful job. Actually, that makes it really much easier to find the books. So how do we distinguish those books from the other collections? I think there were some labels we, were talking about, in fact, with Katie, I think during the summer at some point. So are they like, the book plates that we have from the Galton Bequest, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So within the collection, there's two discrete collections. So the core of the collection is Francis Galton's personal library. And then the rest of the collection is a working library of the Galton Laboratory. And there are different labels that indicate which books originally belong to which collection, although there is some overlap because Galton's books ended up in the working library as well. So there are labels saying Galton Bequest 1911, and there's labels saying Galton Laboratory.
Yeah.
Then within the Galton Laboratory, a lot of the books were books that were purchased by researchers who were active in the laboratory. Mainly Carl Pearson bought a lot of books from the library, so a lot of the books in the library have his stamp.
Yeah, so it's a quite interesting library. Really, it brings together, both the laboratory and the personal Galton collection, really. So yeah, and I'm assuming, do we have any uncatalogued books? We don't. I think I'm assuming everything we have has been catalogued and everything is available, really.
Yes, there is a very small proportion of the collection that's still awaiting cataloguing, which is mainly off-prints from journal issues and single issues and sort of grey material like that. But the vast bulk of the collection is catalogued and available for consultation.
Yeah. And am I right that these books, you can't really borrow them, but you can actually see them through Special Collections? Am I correct?
Exactly, like all of the other collections that we look after, you can't borrow them because the collections by their very nature are unique. So we can't allow readers to take them home because of the risks that would entail. But people can come, well, at the moment, our reading rooms are closed because of the pandemic, but in the normal circumstances, people can book an appointment to see any items from our collections in one of our 3 reading rooms. We've got 2 reading rooms on campus in central London and 1 reading room in Kew at the National Archives as well. And people can view the material there.
Yeah, great. So they go through the normal process of having to request the material from the reader services, and then, the material is delivered for them and they can just book an appointment to come and view it.
Exactly.
America, do you want to tell us if there is anything additionally interesting in terms of these books? I mean,
yeah, so one of the other really interesting aspects about the library collection is that there's about 50 books that have letters from the authors, primarily to Galton and Pearson. And so that gives a real insight into the network that the Galton Laboratory was part of and the network of researchers working on eugenics at the time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly the interesting thing about books like that, it's not just the actual text, the book, but it's also the other details that you can find in there. Something like this, for example, is absolutely brilliant to be, able to see the connection. So yeah, that's great. Well, thanks very much, Erica. And now to you, Katie, the star of the collection, really.
Yeah. Thank you.
So for those of you who don't really know Katie, I think you were the one who actually catalogued the bulk of the collection, or what we call really, collection that is related to eugenics. And I think it's called, is it the Genetics Collection? Am I correct?
Yeah, kind of. So I was first recruited to UCL in 2011 to manage the cataloguing project for a number of archives that were going to be included in a project run by the Wellcome Trust, which is called the Code Breakers, Makers of Modern Genetics project. And that's the digital resource that you can find now on the Wellcome Collection website. So I did some of the cataloguing, but I also managed a small team of cataloguers. So some of it is actually my words in the catalogue, but a lot of it was done by a lot of very hardworking people to get all the metadata online.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to say, I mean, having to work with archives during the pandemic when, the archives obviously are closed, it's absolutely brilliant to be able to see tiny, tiny details about material appearing online, complete with dates, venues of lectures. Is just, from a researcher's point of view, is just absolutely brilliant. So I think people underestimate the amount of work that is going behind the scenes,
Oh, definitely. Yeah, because I think we did about 4 collections for that project. Not all of them were digitized, but the whole thing took us about 2.5 years. With a team of 4 people working on it. So it takes a long time to do. And I think the only reason really why those collections are done in so much detail, where it's kind of to the extent of having the actual date and contents of individual letters in some cases, is because it was for the digitization project. Because you take an image of an item, you also need the metadata that tells you what you're looking at. So for those collections, they are done in a lot of detail. The same isn't true of all of our catalogues.
No, and it's exactly that, actually, that people also underestimate the amount of research you yourself have to do, as an archivist, in order to be able to give an accurate description of what you have in front of you in the context of where it belongs. I think it's absolutely astonishing, I mean, from a researcher's point of view, as I said, and especially now during the pandemic, it's absolutely brilliant. So yeah, if you want to tell us which archives and collections do we have really at UCL that are kind of viewed as being part of these eugenics collections we have?
Yeah, so the main collections that people come to look at in relation to history of eugenics, obviously Francis Galton and Carl Pearson. So both of those figures left pretty much all of their personal and research papers to the university. And there's also the Galton Laboratory collection, which Colin now looks after, but was managed as an archive at one point. Then there's some of the less well-known collections that are also looked at in relation to history of genetics, are JBS Haldane, Lionel Penrose, C.A.B. Smith. They all studied genetic disease in one way or another. That doesn't mean that they were eugenicists, but that their work is relevant in studying the context of history of eugenics at UCL. But I think also because eugenics it's so pervasive throughout society that there are a lot of collections that do touch on eugenics in some way, just because a lot of work that was done in biological, statistical sciences and social sciences throughout the 20th century either could be or has been used to either further or to disprove eugenic ideas in some way. So those collections are a good starting point, but there's a lot of, obviously you all know there are a lot of different avenues of research that you could go down. And it's at that point that you kind of need to branch off and decide for yourself what's worth looking at.
Yeah, exactly. And can you also explain to us, because obviously there is also the Institute of Education and there is some material there as well, but I don't, how does this work with our collection? I mean, is this one collection and can we find it on the catalogue?
Yeah, so at UCL, we manage records and archives under the umbrella of Special Collections. So that obviously includes Rare Books and Erica's team. So Colin manages the university's own records and I manage collections of archives that have been donated or deposited with UCL by outside people, organisations. There's a lot of overlap within that. And historically, that's how it worked. Now, when the IOE merged with UCL, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, I think, there's already an archive at the IOE. And so they now fall under Special Collections as well. But there's an IOE archivist or an archivist post. There's actually a number of people who look after the institutional records of the IOE and the deposited and donated archives at the IOE. And then a head of archives who oversees both sites. So the IOE have their own reading room, but their collections have just been merged. Their catalogues of their collections have just been merged with our own. So there's now one single catalogue that will show you the UCL archives and the IOE archives, but you'll be directed to 2 different places depending on where they're stored.
Exactly. And as far as I can remember from the archives catalog as well, you can even specify which part of Special Collections you want to look at. I think it was IOE, I think it's CIS is another one, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, normally you would just search on a general, you won't specify if you're not entirely sure where the collection is. But yeah, there is also this option really from our catalog. You can tell us a bit more about the Institute of Education archives and, is there any interesting material that you think, connects to eugenics at UCL?
There are bits and pieces throughout the archive. So there isn't a particular archive in the same way that we've got the Galton or the Pearson papers for the kind of the UCL collections. But I know you've asked me before about Cyril Burt, who was a proponent of Galton's work, and he worked at both the London Day Training College, which was a precursor to the IOE, and also at UCL. So he does crop up in the IOE institutional records, as well as some of the other collections. He was found to have falsified his data on intelligence testing, I think, to support his hypothesis. So there's a lot of references to him and people who didn't like him very much, essentially. A lot about his work being discredited, which is probably quite interesting from a eugenics history point of view. And then in general, there's a lot in various collections on intelligence testing, child development, kind of cohort studies and things like that, which would be kind of more of a broad study, I think. Such as I think one example we had was the papers of Brian Simon, who was against intelligence testing and pro comprehensive education. So there'll be kind of material where eugenics is being discredited, I think, which might be quite interesting.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Institute of Education archives, they're not really digitized, are they? So this is a case of basically identifying the material you want to see, and then you have to check with Special Collections to be able to see the originals, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, you would contact the IOE archives to
Yeah.
go and look at the
In this
IOE
case,
collections.
yeah. Great. And so, yeah, let's move on a little bit about where we keep our archives and how people can view it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because everybody probably thinks that everything is down in Gower Street, but in fact it isn't, is it?
No, so the bulk of UCL archives are stored at the National Archives as our off-site storage, essentially. We have a small amount of storage on site in Bloomsbury, not very much at all. All of the collections that I mentioned earlier are stored at TNA. So we have a reading room there. We have a reading room in the Wilkins building. So if you want to come and see anything, then you search catalogue, tell us what it is that you want to come and see, and we'll help you make an appointment. There's sometimes some flexibility over which reading room it is that we would direct you to. And as I mentioned, if you want to see material at the Institute of Education, you would normally go to the IOE reading room to see that.
And also to say, from the researcher's point of view, I think people quite often underestimate how long it takes for something to come from the TNA, because obviously, you know, there is only once a week, you know, van coming, so you need to allow a bit of time, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. In normal times, then we would need about 2 weeks notice anyway. So obviously, when we were open during the autumn, I think we were asking for quite a lot of notice because the COVID safe issues made it all a bit challenging.
Exactly. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this intriguing kind of, well, actually first, if you want to talk to us about this idea of some archives being closed access, restricted access, or, you know, and how does this work, how the decision is made? Because I think I noticed in some of our eugenics archives, I think there was 1 or 2 items that were either restricted access or closed. Can you tell us how this works?
Yeah, so this is to do with, at the time it was the Data Protection Act when we were cataloguing it, now it's GDPR, and it's to do with whether a record holds something called special category data. So that's normally, in the context of the genetics collections, it's normally medical data, so patient records and things like that. If it holds something that is special category data about a particular individual who you can identify from the record, then a record will be closed, sometimes restricted depending on the type of data that it holds. And it will always have an end closure date. So we'll work out how old the person would have been there for their 100th birthday. If we don't know that they've already died, then the record will become open.
Yeah, great. So yeah, let's move on to the digital side of things now, and this idea that you know, I've seen quite a lot of people being a bit confused as to, does the Wellcome Trust has the same Galton papers that we do? Do they have something additional? So can you explain to us what happened there? And
so with the Codebreakers project that I mentioned at the start, so the Wellcome Trust doesn't physically hold any of our archive collections, but because some of the collections were digitized by them for this project, you can see digital images and our metadata in their online catalogue. So you can use their website to see images of material from our collections, but they don't physically have those papers. They have things that complement our collection, like Eugenics Society and things like that, and a lot of the other collections that are included in the same project. But if you want to see the originals, you'll need to come to us.
Yeah, exactly. And to say also that for the digitized version of the archives, of course, we have our own collection at UCL, at the Digital Collections. And as far as I'm aware, the majority of the archives that have been digitized, they can also be found through the Explore catalog, which is even easier, really, if you know how to look for that. Now, the very interesting question, do we have objects on our archives, or is it just papers we have?
So in general, we don't have objects in our collections. We don't generally take them because they're not archives. they're not records, therefore they're
Yeah.
not archives. But we do take them occasionally when they add to our understanding of a collection or when they would otherwise be destroyed. So a Galton collection, for example, most of his objects, like the bean counter, personal possessions and things like the hair samples, the glass eyes, they're all part of the museum collection managed by UCL Culture, and then his papers form the archive. But the word papers also covers quite a lot of different formats. So it could be letters and publications, but it could also be photographs. We've got a lot of glass plate negatives, fingerprint cards and things like that. So it's not just flat written paper all the time. We do have a couple of microscopes of uncertain provenance that we think came from the Galton laboratory. And I think we only took those because nobody else wanted them. So in general, no, we don't have the objects, but you will come across them occasionally.
Yeah, and that's exactly the next question about what's the relationship between the Galton papers and the Galton collection. So essentially what you say is just one collection really, it's just the papers are on the archives and the objects you would normally find in the museum, isn't it? That's how.
Yeah, so the archive and the museum collection, they started out as essentially the same thing. They are Galton and Carl Pearson's possessions. So they're all the papers and working notes, but it's also all the things that they had. So the papers, a lot of the papers were given to the library by Galton's executors. This has been about 1911, and they've been added to over time as people bought things kind of relating to Galton. But in general, most of the paper-based and the photographic material is now a Special Collections, and a lot of the personal possessions and objects that were at the Galton laboratory are now at the museum.
Yeah. Great. I think that kind of clarifies a few things about what's happening with the Wellcome Trust, what kind of images are there compared to what we have, and also how the whole thing works with the Galton collection that everybody knows at the museums. Of course, that was really, brilliant. Thank you very much, Katie. And now moving on to Colin. Colin, your collection, the most intriguing of everything, probably. So can you tell us a few things about what is really the Records Office and where does it belong?
Well, thanks for that very flattering introduction. I don't think intriguing has ever been applied by anyone else to our collections, but I will certainly agree with that. So the Records Office is a part of Special Collections. So just like Erica's and Katie's spheres, we're part of Special Collections. And we look after the college archive, which Katie's mentioned. So anything that's generated by UCL, as well as supporting staff in how they manage their records now. So their current records, their admin records, their research, and complying with regulations to do with that.
And am I right that the bulk of the material that you kind of inherited as part of the Records Office actually came from another part of the university? Was it the States? Am I wrong about it?
Yeah, no, we were originally called the Records Department. And as far as I can tell, it's a bit murky. But I think it originally reported directly to the secretary, and then it became part of the Bursars Department, which then became the States, because our main role in those days was to look after things like the council minutes, the standing committees, the property deeds, the really sort of core admin of a university. And then we moved to library about 10 years ago.
And so just when you mentioned the council meetings, if you can tell us a bit about the kind of material that someone would expect to find at the Records Office, and is it just archives? Is it books that you have, collections? How does this work?
Yeah, so it's very much the core of it, and the bulk of it is the archive of UCL itself, as well as University College Hospital. That's not directly relevant to what we're talking about today, but I think it's always worth mentioning. And that goes back to the foundation of both UCL and UCH. So it's the records of administration, like the minutes that I've mentioned. correspondence. There is a vast collection of correspondence going back to the beginning. I think it's about 200 boxes, so that's a really rich source. We have student records, some staff records, patient records, architectural drawings, magazines, and then the more ephemeral kinds of things like leaflets, posters, things to do with student life and societies. You mentioned printed material, so we do have, I should mention, Katie mentioned the Galton Laboratory collection, so that's a separate collection, but we do manage it. So that's something that we manage. But we also manage what we call college collection, and that's about 3,000 items, mainly books, some journals and slightly ephemeral items. And it's printed material that UCL has produced, like our annual reports and annual calendars that we used to bring out. Well, every year it's annual. Any books published by UCL Press. We currently have our own press, and we have had in the past, actually. But also books about UCL, so any histories of UCL, biographies of UCL figures, histories of departments, printed lectures, like inaugural lectures, that kind of thing, that used to be then produced and published in physical form. And some books that are by prominent UCL people, like Alex Comfort. We had an event last month on him, or Mary Stopes. I think we have a few of her items.
So yeah, it's a really impressive collection, to be honest. And anybody who is working on anything that has to do with UCL departments, it's basically what they really need to see. You really need to, at least be aware that there is this collection as well, where you can find material about how the college was working. And and can you tell us from this, I think some of it is actually digitized, am I right? Council meetings or some of it?
Yes. Yeah, so I'll start with what isn't, well, let's start with the positive. No, let's start with the positive. College collection is catalogued. It's fully catalogued. It's on Explore, so it's quite easy to find things. There's a short guide on the Special Collections website, which tells you how it's structured, so how the classification works, and that's quite helpful. The Hospital Archive is fully catalogued, and you can find that. The College Archive isn't fully catalogued, but if you use, so there's a reference code, UCLCA. If you use that on the Special Collections online catalogue, you will be able to find what we do have catalogued. And if you don't find what you're looking for, which when it comes to eugenics is very likely, we're always happy for people to get in touch, and really they're going to need to, because our descriptions or catalogues, if you can call it that, of that kind of material, it's not public yet. But there is a history of UCL's section or page on the digital collections site, and that brings together the materials that are relevant to the history of UCL. So you can find the calendars there, and they're very useful for starting with researching this, because it's general information about UCL. So you can find lists of students, descriptions of departments.
I think courses as well, am I right? Departments and the courses that each department was offering every year. It's quite fascinating.
They pretty much amount to prospectuses in there. So there's a lot of useful information there. And that history of UCL site also has things like photographs, which there is some relevant material there, and things like magazines, student magazines.
And it's also this, of course, readers can request material, and am I right that it goes again through UCL Special Collections, so you have to see it in the reading room?
Yeah, so in pre-COVID times, yes, you could come or we would identify what you need, and you'd be able to request it through us or through the general special collections. It doesn't really matter. And
and that's also, I think you've already talked about it in terms of eugenics and what collections you might have at the records office. Of course, it's the Galton Laboratory collection, which is, I think, is described as the business archive, I think, of the Galton Laboratory, essentially.
Yes and no. So the Galton Laboratory collection that's already catalogued and accessible, that is there and available for anyone. But what we might have included, because again, it's all history. So the history of Katie's described how she's described code breakers and how all that came about, and how it's catalogued in great detail. But while that was going on, Records Office wasn't remotely part of Special Collections, and so what the material that we had wasn't taken into account, and really can be regarded side by side with things like Galton or what we now call Galton Laboratory. So as you say, we have the administrative archive, if you like, of the Galton Laboratory. We've got the correspondence, we've got a few photographs, we've got the admin records, research records, I think they're called Bertillon cards, the ones that where anthropometric measurements recorded, that kind of thing. Detailed research material, handprints.
And I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, part of the Galton Laboratory is the famous photograph of the anthropometric laboratory that Galton had in the 1884 International Health Exhibition. If I'm not mistaken, I think it is part of that. So it's
that's there. Those few photographs that we have they're there. They were kind of, it's not that long ago that we found them, just buried in admin files. So
and
it's not ideal what we have now, but we have found a lot more than we thought.
That's exactly my point about the archives, that it takes a lot of work from a lot of people in order to be able to catalog it, let alone digitize it, because there's also conservation quite often that people don't really understand that needs to be done before digitizing something and making it accessible to the public as well. So it's really a lot of work going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
So.
And yes, it would be great to get more of that done. But at the moment, we at least have identified pretty much what we have in relation to Galton Laboratory and eugenics, and we can help people access that.
Yeah. Great, that's absolutely great. Thank you very much, Erica, Katie, and Colin. That was really brilliant discussion about the archives and the collections we have at Special Collections. And thank you very much for sharing also your insight about how the material is available to the public, how we, users like me, researchers, how they can find the material and how they can request it as well. So hopefully that will clarify a few things about our collections. And very much looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.